Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the Khmer Rouge.
Oh, yeah.
And specifically, we're going to be tackling the question that a lot of you have had, which is, how did such a brutal regime,
Right.
how could they possibly stay in power?
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to be unpacking.
A really, really interesting question.
Yeah, and as always, we've got some really good source material for this one. So we're
Yeah.
going to be looking at a 1995 master's thesis
Okay.
from the Naval Postgraduate School
Mhm.
called The Heirs of Angkor, an analysis of Khmer Rouge viability.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting thesis
Yeah.
because the author really dives deep into how the Khmer Rouge used symbolism and myths and rituals,
Right.
almost like a PR campaign to gain and maintain power.
Yeah. It's like a dark arts PR campaign, to really tap into the cultural and historical landscape.
And that's one of the things that the thesis really emphasizes is that these regimes don't just appear out of thin air. Right.
Yeah.
They're rooted in the history and the culture of the place.
Exactly.
And that's where we're going to start today is with the sort of the historical and cultural context of Cambodia.
Okay.
So the thesis talks about Cambodia's history. It had a long history of strong monarchical rule, very hierarchical social structure, and of course it was very deeply connected to Buddhism.
Right. Yeah.
So how did these factors play into the rise of the Khmer Rouge?
Well, if you think of Cambodia, you think of this land that's steeped in tradition.
Right.
Respect for authority is so ingrained in the people.
Right.
And there's this yearning for a glorious past. And even when the French colonized Cambodia, ironically, they kind of fueled this sentiment because French archaeologists rediscovered Angkor Wat
Oh, right.
and those other ancient temples.
Yeah.
And that kind of reignited this sense of national pride that the Khmer Rouge would later manipulate.
So it's almost like the French handed them this
Yeah.
really powerful symbol on a silver platter.
You could say that, yeah. And you also have to remember the centuries-long conflict with Vietnam, and that created this potent mix of anti-Vietnamese sentiment
Right.
and these myths of Khmer racial superiority.
Yeah.
So these were these powerful currents
Yeah.
that were just waiting to be harnessed.
Right. And the Khmer Rouge harnessed them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so how did this all translate into actual power for the Khmer Rouge?
Well, I think it's fascinating how they use symbolism to bridge that gap.
Okay.
So think about Angkor Wat,
Mm.
right? It's this magnificent temple complex.
All right.
It's a symbol of ancient Khmer greatness.
Yeah.
So the Khmer Rouge twisted its meaning and claimed they were the true heirs to this legacy.
So they weren't just offering political change. They were offering this.
They were offering a return to a mythical golden age.
Yeah. Wow.
And they played on these deep-seated anxieties.
Mhm.
They claimed Vietnam was plotting to destroy Khmer culture.
Oh, wow.
And that resonated with people who felt like their identity was under threat. This wasn't just about politics. This was about survival.
Right.
This was about protecting the very soul of the nation.
It's scary how they tapped into those fears.
Yeah.
But this was all just kind of the backdrop, right?
Right.
So how did they actually mobilize people? How did they get people to follow them?
Well, remember that power vacuum we talked about?
Right. The French left.
The French left, the monarchy was weakened,
Right.
and people were looking for answers.
Yeah.
So the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, stepped into this void.
Okay.
And now they were influenced by communist movements, but they were really clever in adapting those ideologies to the Cambodian context.
So they weren't just mimicking like Mao or Lenin or...
No, not at all.
Okay.
They focused on the peasantry,
Right.
and they painted them as the true heart of the nation,
Okay.
the ones who would overthrow this corrupt elite.
Yeah. And they were masters of propaganda.
Oh, yeah.
Really blending fact and fiction to create these narratives that targeted specific groups. I was really struck by how they appealed to the Islamic Sham minority
Oh, right.
and promised them revenge against supposedly Buddhist oppressors.
Yeah, that's a classic tactic of extremist movements.
Yeah.
Exploit pre-existing divisions, inflame those grievances,
Right.
and offer these simplistic solutions that resonate with people's deepest fears and desires.
And sadly, it worked.
Yeah.
And by 1975, this really toxic brew of ideology manipulation and historical resentment all culminated in the Khmer Rouge taking control of Cambodia,
Right.
which set the stage for what we know as the Reign of Terror.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, I think it's important for us to make sure we understand this concept of symbolic action, which the author really kind of puts at the center of the thesis.
Right.
So what exactly does he mean by that, and why is it so important to understanding the Khmer Rouge?
Okay, so symbolic action, in this case, refers to acts that are deliberately designed to convey a message, to evoke emotions, and ultimately reshape people's perception of reality.
Wow.
So it's about going beyond just words and using tangible actions, rituals, symbols,
Right.
to really rewrite the narrative and control people's behavior.
So it's not just about talking the talk, it's about walking the walk,
Exactly.
but in a very calculated way.
Right. Very calculated and manipulative.
Yeah. So can you give us some examples of how the Khmer Rouge did this?
Sure. Remember how they emptied the cities and forced everyone into the countryside?
Oh, right. Yeah.
That wasn't just about agricultural reform.
Yeah.
It was a symbolic act
Okay.
of erasing the old order, this corrupt urban life,
Right.
and creating a new society of pure peasants.
So even these actions, however brutal they were,
Yeah.
they were carefully chosen to send a message
Right.
and reinforce their ideology.
Absolutely.
But how did they actually get people to go along with this? How did they implement these radical changes?
Right.
This kind of leads us into that dark chapter of the Khmer Rouge, which is the Reign of Terror.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where the true horror of the Khmer Rouge's symbolic action really becomes apparent.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. The thesis really kind of, gets into the specifics of that period.
Yeah.
It goes beyond just saying, it was bad, and actually tries to analyze the mechanics of how they exerted this control.
Exactly. Their goal was to completely reshape Cambodian society.
Yeah.
Forge this agrarian utopia they envisioned.
Right.
They didn't just want obedience. They wanted total ideological conformity.
Yeah. One of the examples that I found really striking was, that forced relocation of people from the cities to the countryside.
Just imagine you're ripped from your home, your life, everything you know.
Yeah.
And forced to work in the fields.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just about labor. This was about stripping you of your individuality, your sense of self.
Yeah. The thesis argues that, this was a key part of their symbolic strategy.
Right.
To kind of erase the old Cambodia, the corrupt urban life.
Right.
And replace it with this idealized vision of the peasant.
And they went to extraordinary lengths to enforce this.
Yeah, how so?
They abolished money, private property, even traditional family structures.
Wow.
Everyone had to wear the same black peasant clothing.
Right.
So it was a powerful visual symbol
Yeah.
of this forced equality.
It's like they were trying to create a living tableau of their ideology.
Exactly.
But of course, this equality was anything but.
Right.
The thesis documents the horrific conditions in these labor camps.
Yeah.
The starvation, the disease, the constant fear.
And the executions. Let's not forget the killing fields.
Right.
The Khmer Rouge, twisted this concept of enemies of the people to justify the murder of anyone who didn't fit their mold.
And this included, intellectuals, artists.
And anyone who represented the old order,
Right.
they were targeted.
It's just mind-boggling how they managed to indoctrinate so many people, turn neighbor against neighbor.
Yeah, it's really scary.
The thesis talks about how they even manipulated Buddhist rituals to serve their own agenda.
Think about it. Cambodia was deeply Buddhist,
Right.
a religion that emphasizes compassion and enlightenment.
Right.
But the Khmer Rouge twisted these teachings, preaching self-denial and complete submission to the collective good.
Wow.
They even forced monks to work in the fields.
Oh, wow.
A blatant violation of Buddhist principles.
It's just such a stark example of how religion,
Yeah.
even something as peaceful as Buddhism, can be perverted to serve the ends of this totalitarian regime.
And this manipulation extended to every aspect of life.
Right.
They controlled what people ate, what they wore, what they said, even what they thought.
It's incredible.
They bombarded people with propaganda, revolutionary songs, slogans, public confessions.
Wow.
It was a relentless assault on the human psyche.
Yeah, and tragically, this campaign of terror worked.
Yeah.
Millions died, not just from starvation and overwork, but from being tortured, executed.
Simply for being suspected of disloyalty.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. The thesis paints a truly harrowing picture of this period.
Yeah.
And makes a really compelling case for how this use of symbolic action was a key part of their ability to implement these radical and horrific policies.
Absolutely.
This makes me wonder, though, about the people who lived through this.
Right.
The thesis does mention resistance.
Yeah.
But how did people cope with this level of control and fear?
Well, it's a testament to the human spirit that even in the face of such overwhelming oppression, acts of defiance, however small, did occur.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure, people whispered stories, they hid books, they clung to fragments of their old lives.
Wow.
It was a dangerous game.
Right.
And the consequences of being caught were dire.
Yeah, this brings up another important point from the thesis, which is their obsession with racial purity, which was fueled by those historical myths we talked about earlier, led to the systematic persecution of minorities. You're absolutely right. The Cham Muslims, the Vietnamese, the Chinese, even Khmer people with perceived impurities were brutally targeted.
It's just a horrific reminder of how dangerous these kinds of ideologies can be. And it's not just a historical curiosity.
Right.
The thesis argues that understanding the Khmer Rouge's tactics, their manipulation of symbols, their exploitation of fear, is crucial if we want to recognize and combat similar movements today.
You're absolutely right. These tactics aren't unique to the Khmer Rouge.
Right.
They're used by extremist movements all over the world.
So how can we do that effectively? How can we guard against being manipulated by these kinds of tactics?
Well, that's where the next chapter of the Khmer Rouge story becomes particularly relevant.
Okay.
Remember, they didn't just disappear after the Vietnamese intervention in 1979.
Right.
They adapted, shifted their strategies, and remained a potent force for years to come.
So even after their reign of terror was officially over, they still posed a threat. How did they manage to remain viable?
That's what we'll explore in the final part of this deep dive.
Okay.
The Khmer Rouge's story is a sobering reminder that even in the face of defeat, extremist ideologies can persist and even reemerge in new forms.
It's a chilling thought, but one we need to confront. Understanding how they survived, how they adapted, might give us clues on how to counter such movements in the future.
Precisely by looking at how they navigated the post-1979 landscape, we can gain valuable insights into the resilience of extremist ideologies and the ongoing challenges of building a truly just and equitable society.
Okay, so we're back. And, I think a lot of people are probably wondering, like, how could a group like this, a group responsible for such horrific acts, how could they possibly remain a force to be reckoned with after being ousted from power?
It's a good question.
Yeah, it almost defies logic, doesn't it?
It does, but as the thesis points out, the Khmer Rouge were incredibly adaptable. They went from being the rulers of this totalitarian state to waging a guerrilla insurgency.
Right.
But all the while clinging to these core tenets of manipulation and violence.
And as we've talked about, throughout this whole deep dive, symbolism played a huge role.
Oh, absolutely.
In their continued viability.
Yeah.
They were masters of rebranding.
They were, think about it. The world had witnessed the horrors of democratic Cambodia.
Right.
To have any chance of survival, they needed a drastic makeover.
So what did they do? Did they just say, like, oops, our bad, we're the good guys now?
Not quite. But they did make some pretty shocking claims.
Okay.
They publicly renounced their communist ideology.
What?
And started espousing democracy and free markets.
Oh, wow, that is a complete 180.
It is.
Did anyone actually buy it?
Surprisingly, yes.
Really?
There was a strong desire in the international community for a peaceful resolution to the Cambodian conflict. And the Khmer Rouge, sensing this, presented themselves as reformed and ready to participate in democratic elections.
But the thesis suggests that this was all a facade.
Exactly.
Right.
While they were making these public pronouncements, their internal structure remained rigidly authoritarian.
Right.
Pol Pot, though officially retired, still held immense power.
Wow.
And their ideology hadn't actually changed.
So they were playing this double game.
Yeah.
Presenting a moderate face to the world.
Right.
But secretly maintaining their extremist core.
Exactly.
It's chilling how they were able to kind of exploit the international community's desire for peace.
And they used this newfound legitimacy to their advantage.
How so?
Well, they leveraged their control of valuable resources, particularly timber, to fund their operations and maintain influence.
So they essentially became like timber warlords.
Yeah, pretty much.
Profiting from the very land they claimed to be liberating.
Right. It's a stark contrast to their earlier rhetoric of agrarian utopia.
Yeah, the thesis author actually points out, the environmental devastation
Oh, yeah?
caused by their logging
This
operations,
is terrible.
which is just another layer of tragedy to their legacy.
It is.
But even with this new facade and their control of resources,
Mm-hmm.
they still faced opposition, right?
He did.
How did they deal with that?
Well, they became experts at playing different factions against each other.
Okay.
They'd engage in negotiations, promising peace and cooperation,
Right.
only to back out or sabotage the process at the last minute.
So they were using the negotiations as a tool of manipulation
Exactly.
to sow discord and undermine the Cambodian government.
Precisely. They understood that a fractured and unstable government
Right.
would only bolster their own position.
Make them seem like the only viable alternative.
Exactly.
And tragically, they never really abandoned their reliance on violence.
No, they didn't.
The thesis documents how they continued to use kidnappings and assassinations,
Yeah.
targeted attacks to maintain this climate of fear.
Yeah, it was a reminder that beneath this veneer of moderation,
Right.
the Khmer Rouge were still the same brutal force,
Right.
capable of unspeakable acts.
And they never forgot that fear was a powerful weapon.
Absolutely.
And they used it to silence dissent and deter any real challenge to their authority.
It's a sobering reminder
Hmm.
that these extremist ideologies,
Yeah.
even when seemingly defeated, can linger in the shadows,
Right.
waiting for an opportunity to resurface.
And that's why this deep dive has been so important.
It has been.
Understanding the Khmer Rouge, their tactics, their manipulation of symbols, is crucial for recognizing and confronting similar threats today.
I completely agree. It's not just about learning history.
Right.
It's about equipping ourselves with the knowledge and critical thinking skills
Yeah.
to recognize these patterns and prevent such horrors from happening again.
The author of the thesis leaves us with a really powerful thought, which is even though the Khmer Rouge, eventually kind of faded from prominence, their legacy of violence and social upheaval continues to haunt Cambodia.
It does.
And it's a reminder that the wounds of the past can run deep.
We do.
And that the pursuit of justice and reconciliation is an ongoing process.
It is, yeah.
Well, that's a heavy thought to end on.
It is.
But an important one.
Yes.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey into a truly dark chapter of history.
It's been my privilege to share these insights with you.
Well, thank you. And to all of our listeners out there,
Yeah.
as you continue to explore, the complexities of the Khmer Rouge,
Right.
remember to be vigilant, be critical,
Yeah.
and never take for granted the fragility of peace and the importance of defending human dignity.
Very well said.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.